I'm Mandy Curnow, and I'm going to talk to you today about the road to carbon neutral and particularly how horticulture might fit into that and what horticulture's road would be in itself. Just as a little bit of background, horticulture does make up a very, very small proportion of the state's reported agricultural emissions. The livestock sector is by far the largest contributor, with about 70% and 7.8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. The method, though, of reporting is really important to understand. There's a difference between what the state report emissions are and what industry has to report. And the state reported emissions are the things that you normally hear on the news or quoted in the media. Agriculture is 10% of the state's emissions. That's actually how the state has to report its emissions as part of Australia. However, industry has some other opportunities for reporting its emissions. And the other thing is that rather than just reporting agricultural industry as a whole, each of the products that we focus on here in WA have quite a different emissions profile. So we need to have different approaches for that road to carbon neutrality. So coming back to this method of accounting, it really does depend on who's asking the question. The first one, and that's that government or state level reporting, and that's actually determined by the International Panel on Climate Change. It's a set protocol, quite rigid, but it's really so that they're using the same methods of reporting and capturing of data across all countries, and that there aren't gaps or double ups. And agriculture has its own sector. There's 5 sectors. The other one that's of interest to agriculture is the land use change forestry sector, which reports all the sequestration on land, including agricultural land. Now, the other method for greenhouse gas accounting is around what farm businesses would do. So if a farm business wants to know what its total emissions are and what makes up those emissions, there's an approach called farm accounting, which gives you all the emissions up to the farm gate before it leaves the farm gate. Can include sequestration as part of that. You can also do this as from an industry perspective as well, and often they're called LCAs, a life cycle analysis. And this is when consumers and retailers are really asking the question, what's this carbon status of this product? And it usually involves all the emissions up to the retail shelf. So stopping at the farm gate for farm businesses is one thing, but going through to the retail shelf includes the transport to get it to retail, includes packaging and processing, anything like that before it gets to retail. So you can see there's a bit of difference there, but it's really about the boundaries between those two methods, B and C. But I'll talk a little bit more about the government and international reporting. On the right-hand side of the screen, it says National Greenhouse Gas Inventory Accounting for the agriculture sector. Now, this is what is reported for the country and for the state. And there's about 6, well, there's actually 7, but only 6 are there because we don't grow much rice in Western Australia. So about 6 categories there that are involved in that reporting. And you can see the biggest one is enteric methane. That's cows and sheep burping. It's a big proportion of our emissions. The next one around clockwise is manure management, and that's manure from feedlots, dairies, piggeries, those sorts of things. The second biggest chunk is that orange sector, which is agricultural soils, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, what's involved in it. But that's really emissions coming out of our soil base, and it's driven by things like fertiliser and organic matter breakdown, those sorts of things. And then there's liming and urea application and a tiny bit of field burning of crop residues or stubbles. So all that is what's included in the national account. Now, if you move to the left-hand side of the screen, that's actually captured in that olive green box. That's all that is. But you can see there's lots of other emissions created by inputs, such as pre-farm inputs, the manufacturing chemicals and herbicides. Very important part for the horticulture sector. And there's also in the blue box there, you can see energy. and electricity. So electricity used on farm has to be accounted for with its carbon dioxide emissions where it's generated. The next one across is for fuel. So any fuel that's used on farm, which is normally captured in the energy sector, not the agriculture sector, if you're doing national reporting, that has to be added to a farm or a business account or products life cycle analysis. And the fifth one, which is really important to remember, that's that plus minus green box down the bottom, where that's where sequestration takes place. So that can be the balancing side of the account. So we talked about that agricultural soils category, and I just wanted to quickly go a little bit more into that one, the lime emissions and urea emissions, because they are a little bit different. So agricultural soils is either direct soil emissions or indirect. Now, the direct ones are really about fertiliser application, manure, nitrogen that's landed on the soil, those sorts of things. Indirect soil emissions, which is only about 25% of emissions from agricultural soils, it's around leaching, runoff, harvest of biomass, those sorts of things. Lime emissions is made up of carbon dioxide. And it's really the carbon dioxide that's lost when you apply the lime to the land surface. Dissolves, releases CO2. We have to account for that. Urea emissions are a bit the same, in that CO2 as well. So when the CO2 is captured in the urea manufacturing process and we apply it to soils and plants, it releases CO2 and we have to account for that. So those are those very specific sectors in that reporting. Now let's move on to industry emissions or farm level emissions. So you can take these as representative breakdown of farm emissions, but we've done these at an industry level. And I suppose the first thing to notice here is that each industry is really different. Starting with beef on the left, it's really all about enteric methane. There are not many other inputs, really dominates with methane, which is all gas. Now, if you go across to the very far end to grains, you can see it's broken up into lots of different parts, and a lot of grains is driven by both fertilisers, but also by the pre-farm emissions tied up in manufacturing fertilisers and herbicides and getting them to the farm. I've highlighted there horticulture with the box there, and you'll see that the ones within the black line box, they're actually the ones accounted in the national inventory. The other ones, and fuel's quite a big one, then the darker blue is fuel, and the electricity is 28%, and we've got some other fertiliser pre-farm emissions as well. So you can see that there's quite a few on the farm, but there's also quite a few off the farm, but all can be controlled by inputs. So coming back onto that farm business accounting or even industry level accounting, so there's that whole chunk around fertiliser emissions on the farm. And in horticulture, about 29% are direct emissions from fertiliser use and 9% from pre-farm emissions. Nitrogen fertiliser use is the key factor. And I suppose really that's a win-win, because the more efficient your nitrogen use is, the lower your emissions will be and lower your costs will be per yield production. Other thing I wanted to just flag there too is that most of horticulture is in what they call the leaching zone, and anyone who's used one of the online carbon calculators will be asked if they're in the orange zone or the yellow zone. Most horticulture is in the yellow zone, where you have to actually apply quite a significant leaching factor. We've had some success with working with the National Inventory team in Canberra about making that estimate of leaching much better for Western Australian growers. Now, energy use is a pretty big one for horticulture at 46%, so diesel and electricity. And the nice thing about this is these are the ones that can actually change and may change without you having to do too much. So, for example, electricity, the grid is currently about 30% renewables over the year, and they're expecting by 2035 to be 90% renewable. So any electricity used on farm will have a much lower emissions rating for your calculations. And if you swap out to some renewables on farm or before the meter renewables, you'll get further gains, as well as more energy efficient machinery. So there are some great opportunities in horticulture as renewables become cheaper, easier to integrate into your farm, and then on top of that, the decarbonisation of the state grid. Fertilisers being the other big chunk. I wanted to just quickly talk about that because fertiliser, particularly urea production, is a really, really energy intensive process, and the Haber-Bosch process is actually a very, very expensive chemical reaction. But if you can actually change their source of energy to do that to renewables, it can reduce the emissions, the inbuilt emissions in fertiliser like urea considerably. There's also some really, really exciting technology there. If you've got a chance, look a few of these up, where they're doing on-farm manufacture of nitrogen fertiliser. And there's a few different methods, but some of it's about not just biodigesting, but using renewable energy and extracting nitrogen from the air. There's nitricity, which uses a sort of plasma reactor, and they actually got those on a few large scale, as in 200 to 1,000 hectare strawberry fields in the USA. They generate the nitrogen fertiliser on site in this big box, fed by renewable electricity, and the fertiliser goes out in the irrigation lines. So it's pretty exciting stuff. There's a number of different technologies being developed, and I'm pretty sure that we'll get to see some of these things shortly. I'm going to share with you one of these life cycle analyses that I mentioned before. And in-house, we've done one based on a grower in Manjimup, and to get a bit of a representative life cycle analysis and the emissions intensity. That's the amount of CO2 produced per kilo of product. So emissions intensity, total emissions is just the number of tonnes of CO2 produced. So this study really came down to the fact that it was about 3.7 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year, which related to about 320 kilos per tonne of avocado produced. I'll give you a bit of an indicator. That's similar to wheat and barley. Lamb and beef are closer to 11 tonnes per tonne, not 300 kilograms per tonne of avocado. There are some differences depending on the maturity of the plantation and the emissions intensity, but the main drivers still were electricity used for irrigation, fertiliser use, and some of those direct emissions from the soil. We also went through to the packaging and delivered to Canning Vale Market. That was the end point, or the systems boundary of the analysis. And that added about another 160 kilos per tonne, or 160 grams per kilo of avocado. And the packaging materials were a significant part of that. There was some refrigerated transport to market, and then the washing and preserving the fruits also contributed to that. So as I was talking about the boundaries, it's important sometimes to have a look at them from a bit of a visual. So Canning Vale Market over here, you can see the production boundary is the land and the inputs, and the packaging, there's transport to the packing shed, transport to the market, and the inputs in the packing shed. So if we break those down, you can see that the first column is about over 15 years average, what the total emissions were, and then the breakdown. So things like transport was still important, fertiliser, irrigation, and see those there. As you go further to the middle column, that's really just taking it at a point in time at peak production. You can see proportions are pretty similar, just a lower emissions intensity all round because you're producing more kilos of product for the same inputs. And then the third column there is the breakdown of the packaging and so the packaging and the processing for market. The really nice thing about this is when we looked at what other studies were about on avocados, it showed that we were pretty efficient in producing avocados in an emissions perspective. Some of the studies, so for example, the Brisbane one showed quite significantly high emissions. This was done in 2012, and there's probably been a whole lot more efficiencies in their system, and there might be some changes in some of the calculation factors that we use too, but still significantly different. A number of the other studies sort of involved didn't break it up into what their markets were, those sorts of things, but you can see in Mexico, that was a little bit older, but you can see that Western Australian avocados really sat well in that overall estimate. There are variables and they will impact the outcome. As I said about the Brisbane one, there might be some differences. They might have had a different planting density, they might have different maturity ages, those sorts of things. They also had a high use of fertilisers and irrigation, and that might be to do with soil type or other things. The things like different types of packaging is an opportunity to reduce the results of the LCA. So there are things that you can do in amongst this, and fertiliser is one of those things that we hope will change through the manufacturers' efforts in this area. We also undertook a carrot carbon analysis. It wasn't a full LCA, it was more like a farm carbon account. My colleague Christophe Delvardi did this, and it was two harvest dates. It included waste. Now, we didn't do that for the avocado one. But as you can see there, it was about 40 hectares of carrots sown in April, sown in October. There was some small differences in the yield and waste. There were similar fertiliser applications, similar water. Not similar water. Annual diesel consumption was about the same, but the electricity use was different. And let's have a look at it broken up here. So two sets of graphs, the April one and the October one. The April had increased irrigation requirements, so that was what drove the high electricity consumption. It had higher yields, but more waste generation. And if you include waste in the crop, it's quite a big impact. I want to just tease apart a little bit on waste, because crop losses or waste in Australian horticulture farms, this was reported by ABARES last year, and just some of the categories of waste and the percentage of crop losses. Now, I'm sure this is no real new news to you, but it was just interesting to see the range of wastes that you get for the different crops and what's done with them. There are opportunities out there for waste, and there are a number of companies doing some fabulous things. And I've just put in here just a little bit about one example, C12. So they're recycling agricultural plastics and organic waste to make it into biochar. And at this stage, biochar is allowed to be used for road mix. The CBH, which is a large producer of grain dust, plastic, all sorts of things like that in all of their facilities, including ports. That's going to be processed into biochar at this stage, if not into renewable energy through a biodigester as well. So the C12 has also been looking at waste from strawberry production, the plastics in there, and they were found that they were able to use just about all the current packaging that was being used in their digesters, which is really exciting. Just wanted to finish up with just a little bit about where DPIRD wants to focus its efforts, and this has been based on a whole lot of consultation with industry groups, and I thank those industry groups for their considerable time and patience contributing to our session, and also to the R&D specialists and research institutions who've identified what some of the key strategies or gaps in research are. One of the things we identified that we really wanted to do was to provide an industry level life cycle analysis for all or each horticultural produce. And this hopefully will be able to be used for smaller producers to show a representative emissions profile for the products that they run. I still encourage every horticulture producer to have a play with the online calculator. If you just look up PICCC, that's the University of Melbourne's calculator listing there, there's one for horticulture. Have a play, get a bit of a feel for what your emissions might be. But at the same time, we would like to do these representative LCAs so that people can use those as an independent source of data for what their emissions might be. Also want to really focus on some of those energy opportunities and robotics, because that is one of the biggest categories that there is existing technology and very soon to be adopted technology that the horticulture industry certainly can use. Waste, as we saw, was quite a big driver, and we'd like to focus quite a lot on that, and there's some opportunities with the intensive agricultural animal industries to work in with them around that too. And fertilisers, nitrogen use efficiency and opportunities around reducing fertilisers in conjunction with the grains portfolio. They have big issues with their fertiliser emissions, and there's some great crossovers between the two. And I suppose just to reiterate, more than happy for industry groups to reach out to us to run some online training. There are online training courses or in-person courses being run by a number of different organisations, but check out those calculator tools, which really just require you to put some inputs. They're not particularly complex for horticulture, and they can be found at PICCC. So that's Primary Industries Centre for Climate Change, run out of the University of Melbourne. Google search will find it pretty quickly for you, and have a go at determining what your emissions might be. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Please reach out if you have any questions.
Mandy, congratulations. Very good talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is, especially in horticulture crops like an avocado or other trees, a lot more carbon is being fixed into the structure of the tree, wood and branches. And the other factor is a lot more carbon is pumped into the soil through the root exudates. So when you people are calculating that thing, do they take into account or not?
Very good question. So
Thank
it's
you.
about the sequestration of carbon in the tree and in the soil, particularly in perennial crops. If you're doing a farm business account, sequestration is able to be put alongside it. However, there's some rules around that, and the rules, which can be which can be challenged, is that tree crops are usually turned over and don't have a permanence period. So, for example, you're not keeping avocado trees for 100 years. So they don't meet that permanence one, so they don't count the carbon tied up in the tree because they assume it's going to be burnt or decomposed, so therefore releasing the carbon. However, if you have an opportunity to maintain that carbon in the tree and can show that it's in permanence, and that might be in furniture, it might be digging a great big hole and burying them deeply, not burning them or chipping them, mulching them. So there are opportunities, and at an individual carbon account level, you can make that claim, but you have to be sure that you're showing that that's the case. There'll be new insetting credentials coming out soon. The federal government's sitting on them at the moment, but that gives it an annual carbon account. So any carbon that you grow in that year, i.e. if your trees are growing, you can put it on the plus side of the ledger, and then you put it against your emissions, the minus side. And of course, if you do destroy those trees, you've got to actually account for that. But it's not like carbon credits where they're tradable. This is purely for within the supply chain, within the value chain.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mandy. And I really appreciated the insight into the methodologies and those real live case examples. So thank you very much. Round of applause for Mandy once again.